Alright guys, so over the last couple of days we have been talking about the potential for the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, to issue arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu and several other top Israeli officials for war crimes in Gaza. And to say the least, Benjamin Netanyahu is not happy about this. In fact, he is going full-on freak-out mode and panicking over this prospect. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the ICC here in a minute, but let's just go ahead and start watching this video that Benjamin Netanyahu released. I think it was just yesterday. Now, brace yourselves, guys, because I probably had 17 strokes the first time that I tried watching through this. So let's just go ahead and try to unpack it.
The International Criminal Court in The Hague is contemplating issuing arrest warrants against senior Israeli government and military officials as war criminals. This would be an outrage of historic proportions. International bodies like the ICC arose in the wake of the Holocaust committed against the Jewish people. They were set up to prevent such horrors, to prevent future genocides. Yet now, the International Court is trying to put Israel in the dock. It's trying to put us in the dock as we defend ourselves against genocidal terrorists and regimes, Iran of course, that openly works to destroy the one and only Jewish state.
Do you guys understand how utterly disgusting and despicable it is to use the legacy of the Holocaust, okay, where he's right. These laws against genocide were established in the aftermath of the Holocaust to prevent that from happening again, and you are now turning around and using that to justify your own ongoing genocide. I mean, how disgusting and disgraceful to the memory of Holocaust survivors. Guys, I just yesterday, and maybe I should have pulled this up for the video, but whatever, I saw a video of an 87-year-old Holocaust survivor who was at one of these pro-Palestine protests, and he was asked about the slogan, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." And he described what it meant to him, and what it meant to him, as it means to me and many other people, is a one-state solution with full democratic and civil rights for everybody living within it. Not an ethno-state, not an apartheid, an actual true democracy with full rights for everybody, regardless if you're Jewish or Arab or Muslim or Christian or whatever the case may be. And that was from a Holocaust survivor. I've seen a number of them at some of these protests that have been popping up. And so to use a genocide against Jewish people, to now justify a genocide against Palestinians, there's really nothing more disgusting than that. But we can continue here.
Branding Israel's leaders and soldiers as war criminals will pour jet fuel on the fires of anti-Semitism, those fires that are already raging on the campuses of America and across capitals around the world.
The audacity of this man, the man who has destroyed every single university in Gaza. Some of them were destroyed with controlled demolitions, not in battles with Hamas, okay, not even in airstrikes, okay, where they suspected some Hamas militants were in the basement. Controlled demolitions, meaning they took over the university, rigged it with explosives, and then flattened it into a pancake. The man who has completely destroyed education inside of Gaza, the man who has killed thousands of teachers and students inside of Gaza over the last 6 months, is now criticizing American protesters who are trying to stand against the genocide that he's engaging in and that our government is fully complicit in. The audacity of this motherfucker to speak out of anti-Semitism at these protests, as if that's what this is about. No, that's actual anti-Semitism, is conflating Jewish people with the actions of your maniacal genocidal government. That's anti-Semitism. There are Jewish people who are leading many of these protests on American campuses. How dare you come out and speak about anything that's happening in this country, as we give you every fucking thing that you could possibly ask for. The weapons, the funding, the diplomatic cover at the United Nations, all of that, and you still are trying to control what's happening here in the United States. You're trying to get the U.S. police to crack down even harder than they already are right now on American campuses. And I also just want to point out, circling back to one of the first things he said here, the idea that what Hamas did on October 7th, where there were definitely atrocities that were committed, do not get me wrong, but the idea that that was a genocide, that was genocidal in nature. But what Israel has done over the last 6 months, killing thousands and thousands of more civilians, a higher percentage of civilians than Hamas did on October 7th, that's self-defense? I mean, it's just completely absurd at face value, but we continue.
It will also be the first time that a democratic country fighting for its life according
Okay, you're not a democracy. Can we stop with that? You can't be a democracy and like a theocratic apartheid ethno-state at the same time. Jesus fucking Christ.
to the rules of war, is itself accused of war crimes. The Israeli army, the IDF, is one of the most moral militaries in the world.
I mean, again, can we not even just taper it down a little bit? You can't even go with the route of like, well, war is terrible and difficult and Hamas human shields, which he's going to bring up here in a second. We'll address that. But like, you can't even give like somewhat of a reasonable argument. You have to come out and say you're the most moral army in the world? The most moral army in the world? Really? I think it's kind of the exact precise opposite of that, actually. You guys right now are acting as arguably the single least moral army in the world. How many different stories have we covered of IDF soldiers openly expressing their genocidal intent for the people in Gaza that they are killing? Okay? The people walking around holding up lingerie of some of the women and girls who they have gone and either forced out of their homes or killed, and then they go and they raid their stuff. They're looting people's houses. They're taking lingerie pictures with themselves. They're filming themselves blowing up schools and laughing about it as it happens. They're praising uses of phrases like the story of Amalek that Benjamin Netanyahu appealed to early on in this war. If you even want to call it a war, it's not. It's a genocide. But he used the appeal to Amalek, where it calls for them to completely destroy everything, to kill men, women, children, ox, camel, sheep, whatever. And then you have IDF soldiers on the ground repeating that as they are engaging in these war crimes. And then he turns around and pretends as if, we didn't do anything. Why are we being singled out? We're being singled out because we're a democracy and we're Jewish. No, it's because you've committed repeated war crimes in front of the entire world for 7 months straight. That's why the ICC is potentially thinking about issuing these warrants.
It takes endless measures to prevent civilian casualties, measures that no other army takes. It does so while fighting a terrorist enemy, which uses its own civilians as human shields. You know the truth. Hamas places its weapons, its terrorists, in hospitals, schools, mosques, and throughout civilian areas. They do this in order to win immunity and to maximize civilian casualties. So while Hamas shows no care for the lives of Palestinians and steals humanitarian aid meant for civilians, Israel is facilitating a surge of humanitarian assistance to Gaza. And we do this to ensure that the Palestinian population's humanitarian needs are met, rather than commend Israel.
Okay, so on the humanitarian aid aspect of it, you are currently in the midst of facing an International Court of Justice genocide case where they initially ruled that it's plausible that a genocide is underway. And you're also now facing ICC warrants. Now, the reason he brought up the humanitarian aid is because it looks like these warrants are going to mainly be focused around Israel restricting the aid. This is a totally uncontroversial fact that they have been doing this. Why else is the United States building this pier off of the coast of Gaza, this floating pier, to facilitate more aid getting in? Why was it that after the World Central Kitchen strike, when you committed a war crime and in 3 separate strikes killed a bunch of aid workers who were trying to deliver humanitarian aid to Gaza, why was it that after that, and a tiny bit of pressure from Biden and, behind the scenes, did you guys open up temporarily another port of entry? That you guys turned back on the water for certain parts of Gaza? That you guys allowed bakeries to open? These are some of the stories that came out after that happened. How are you able to allow bakeries to open, turn back on some of the water, and open up some of the avenues for aid to get in if you weren't blocking it originally? Tell me how that makes sense. We're witnessing a man-made famine in the north of Gaza especially, because Israel has been arbitrarily blocking aid from getting in. This is not controversial. This is a fact. We've had stories of even Israeli civilians, as the IDF watches on, who go to the border of Gaza and they set up bouncy castles and they're handing out candy and popcorn and dancing and having raves as they're there to block the trucks from getting into Gaza. We know that you've been doing this. So to come out now, 6-7 months later, after you've already literally killed people by starvation, and pretend as if you're doing, we care about the Palestinian civilians. It's Hamas that doesn't care about the Palestinian civilians. Utterly absurd. Now, on the human shields argument, we've dealt with this so many different times that I don't even know if it's worth pushing back on at this point because it's so ludicrous at face value. Just a couple quick things. Number one, when we're talking about human shields, okay, the Supreme Court in Israel, I don't know if anybody knew this, but the Supreme Court in Israel had to officially rule to ban the IDF from using human shields. Why? Because when they would go and do raids in the West Bank, They would quite literally have an IDF soldier with a gun, and then they would take a Palestinian from the area, and they would put them in front of the IDF soldier with a gun to go and knock on the door of people's houses. That is a textbook, as clear of a case as you could possibly imagine, of using a human shield. That's what the IDF was doing. And if you think they've completely stopped that, then I got a bridge to sell you, right? So that's a real example of using human shields. Now, the second part is, does Hamas operate outside or near, civilian infrastructure? Of course, there's tunnels all over Gaza. That's never been in question. We know that there are tunnels all over, all over the Gaza Strip, that Hamas is using guerrilla tactics. We know all of that. That's not in dispute. What's in dispute is when you get into the specifics, right? After we look at statistics of Israel completely obliterating the Gaza Strip, right? Destroying a majority of the hospitals, every single university again. We look at the indiscriminate targeting of residential buildings that we've seen from reports like from 9/7/2 that Israel refers to as power targets in an effort to try to essentially terrorize the Palestinians into turning against Hamas. When you look at these statistics of what they have destroyed in Gaza, of how many civilians they have killed, to then turn around and come away with the conclusion that and every single one of these airstrikes and every single one of these killings of civilians, that like a Hamas fighter was in the building, that a Hamas fighter was standing behind a child who has a single bullet hole, a sniper bullet to the head or the chest, which is something that we saw from doctors reporting out of Gaza. What was a Hamas fighter standing behind the Palestinian child when you shot him in the head with a sniper? Is that what's happening in every single one of these circumstances? Of course not. I mean, it's just completely ridiculous. And the final thing I'll say about the human shields thing, even if you take their word at face value that in every single one of these strikes there was a Hamas militant in the building or whatever the case may be, let's just think about an analogy for what we're talking about here. Okay, and this is something that gets brought up a lot. I'm not the person who came up with this, but imagine you're in the United States and we have some crazy psycho person who has a gun and he goes into an elementary school, right? And there's a few hundred kids that are at this school. And he takes them hostage, right? So it's a dangerous situation, it's a tense situation. What would be the best response to that? Would it be option A, to try to negotiate with the person, or maybe do a targeted operation, see if you could take out that specific individual, right? Would you try to do something like that in order to try to save the kids and not escalate the situation? Or would you drone strike the school and kill everybody inside of it? Because what Israel has been doing is taking option B every single time, all right? We've gotten the reporting again from 9/7/2. They've been doing a great job on this, of like the Lavender AI programs or the Where's Daddy AI programs, where they specifically go out of their way to wait for these alleged Hamas militants to go home to their families because it's easier for Israel to then just blow up the whole house and kill everybody inside. And for a low-ranking militant who's essentially irrelevant to a military campaign in any real sense, for a low-ranking militant, they think it's acceptable to kill 20 civilians. For a high-ranking militant, they think it's acceptable to kill over 100 civilians. So save me this bullshit about human shields. I mean, it's just completely absurd, but he continues.
For abiding by the rules of war while fighting an enemy that violates every rule of war, including holding 133 Israeli men, women, and children hostage. Who's the ICC targeting? The democracy called Israel.
Okay, to be clear, the ICC is also considering going after Hamas operatives. Okay, so that's just fundamentally not true.
And in targeting Israel, the ICC would be targeting all democracies because it would be undermining their inherent right to defend themselves against savage terrorism and wanton aggression. Clearly, this threat by the ICC is not an attempt to enforce the law. Israel is not even subject to the court's jurisdiction, and it has an independent legal system that rigorously investigates all violations of the law.
I mean, there's nothing to say at this point. There's nothing else to say at this point. Israel has an independent judicial system that rigorously enforces the law. What are we talking about? What are we talking about? How many investigations has the U.S. government claimed that Israel is engaging in since October 7th? And how many of those have we gotten a response to, a conclusion to, some sort of accountability for soldiers? Never. That never happens. And so to be clear about the ICC, right? Israel is not a signatory to the ICC. The United States is not a signatory to the ICC, right? The Palestinian Authority is a signatory to the ICC. And just as another comparison, Russia, not a signatory to the ICC. Ukraine is a signatory to the ICC. So when he talks about like jurisdiction, which is something that's going to come up when we get to Biden here in a second. When he talks about jurisdiction, the ICC has the jurisdiction because the Palestinians are signatories to the ICC. And so the jurisdiction, right, like the ICC is not going to send a police force to go and arrest Netanyahu if they come out with some warrants. But if Benjamin Netanyahu then travels to a country that is a signatory to the ICC, they have an obligation to arrest him, to turn him in to The Hague. So that's how that jurisdictional thing breaks down. Now, I'll skip ahead to the Biden administration because I'm talking about it right now. But here was the response. The Biden administration claims that the ICC cannot prosecute Israel for war crimes. Again, their explanation here is that it's because they're not subject to the ICC. They are not signatories, right? To be clear, guys, this is the exact same argument that Vladimir Putin made when he was laughing off the ICC issuing arrest warrants for him. Now, at the time, Joe Biden, of course, came out and celebrated the ICC issuing this warrant. So we have a direct comparison that has taken place under this Biden administration of when it's a geopolitical adversary, Vladimir Putin, who I think deserves to be sent to The Hague. But when it's our geopolitical adversary like Putin, then it's, oh yeah, we love the ICC. That's great. I'm glad you guys are issuing warrants for him, right? But then when it comes to Israel, it's the complete opposite of that. Oh, they have no jurisdiction. You're using the same fucking argument that Putin used. He said, Russia's not a signatory to the ICC, so we don't recognize this. It's irrelevant to us. Biden is making that exact same argument on behalf of Israel now. Now, to circle back around to all of the what's genocide, what's not genocidal, just over the last couple of days here, guys, Israel's finance minister, this guy Bezalel Smotrich, and de facto governor of the occupied West Bank, called for the, quote, total annihilation of Gaza yesterday. Total annihilation of Gaza. Is the U.S. media going to pick this up? Is Biden going to come out and condemn this as being genocidal? No, he's too worried about from the river to the sea chants on college campuses. Another one, Israeli minister Ben-Gvir calls for execution of Palestinian prisoners to ease overcrowding. This is not even the first time that he said this, guys. And keep in mind, many of the Palestinians who are detainees that Israel has, or in other words, hostages, are people who have never been charged with a crime. They do not get due process. So in many circumstances, he's talking about just executing random civilians who the IDF has picked up and detained and tortured in the meantime. Now, we also have this. Now, this is a separate strike from the other strike I talked about a couple of days ago inside of Rafa, where they also killed a bunch of children. Here from Jeff Stein, Israeli airstrikes on the southern city of Rafa have killed at least 22 people, including 6 women and 5 children, one of which was 5 days old. Just another war crime maybe for the ICC to look at here. Another one that I think maybe the ICC should take a look at. So this is from a story from Haaretz, an Israeli outlet. Palestinians released from Israeli prison describes beatings, sexual abuse, and torture. This is a quote, they were led to the kitchen, where they were stripped and forced to lie on top of one another. They were beaten with clubs and spat on. A guard then started to stuff carrots into the anus of Abu Halil and other prisoners. This is not even, somehow, although this is a really bleak thing to say, this is not even close to the worst reports of sexual abuse that I have seen over the last 6 months. It's not even the worst. But the reason I bring this up as well is obviously it's a human rights abuse, but it's also like, what is the main narrative that we hear to try to justify what Israel is doing in Gaza? It's always, they bring up October 7th, right? And pretend as if history started there. But then the two main things from October 7th have been like the beheaded baby story, the babies in the oven story, right? So killing a bunch of babies or children. And then the second one is the mass rape, story that came out, right? And the New York Times had that whole debunked story and all of that. We covered that on the channel. But it's like, first off, I'm not denying that there likely was instances of sexual abuse on October 7th. I'm sure that there was. But there was never any evidence, there still is no evidence, for any sort of like systemic mass rape or sexual assault on October 7th. That has not been substantiated, okay? But then you have stories like this, and I'm just bringing this up to bring up the contrast, right? Because the beheaded babies, the babies in the oven stories, which were completely debunked, by the way, and as well as the sexual abuse on October 7th, these are the two main things that are repeated every single day by our media, by our politicians, by Israel, in order to justify what they're doing in Gaza. Because they're saying, look at how barbaric and savage Hamas is, or by extension Palestinians are, therefore we're justified in doing what we're doing in Gaza. And it's like, you could take the worst allegations of what Hamas did on October 7th, even ones that were largely fabricated or exaggerated. You could take those allegations and multiply them over and over and over again for what Israel has done to Palestinians. And so then it's like, okay, so what's the conclusion here? if Hamas is the most evil terrorist organization in the history of the world, they're Nazis, they're ISIS, they're everything in between, because of things like sexual abuse on October 7th, or because of killing children on October 7th, then what does that make Israel, who's doing the same thing at a much larger scale? I mean, it's hard to know what to even say about this anymore. Now, on top of this, we also have Netanyahu, because there's been this sort of like hostage deal that's been in the works apparently over the last couple of days, and there were stories about, it's getting close to a potential deal, and Blinken came out and he said Hamas should accept this deal. And now we have Netanyahu telling Blinken that he will not agree to end the war on Hamas as a part of a hostage deal. He will not agree to end the war on Hamas as a part of the hostage deal. So let's be clear. In terms of getting a ceasefire, because the US government, the Israeli government, a lot of other Western European governments have been consistently saying it's Hamas that's blocking the deal. In fact, they're going to say it here just in a second, right? In this byline. They say over and over and over again, it's Hamas that's blocking the deal. The reality is that this kind of a deal has been on the table for months. What Israel wants is a temporary pause in the fighting, during which Hamas releases all of the hostages that they have still in their captivity. And then after that, Israel, as he's saying right here, will absolutely invade Rafa. They absolutely will continue with the genocide. What kind of a deal is that? The deal that has been on the table for months now from Hamas has been, we will release all of the Israeli hostages in exchange for an end to the war, for an actual lasting ceasefire. That's the main blockade to a deal being made. It's Benjamin Netanyahu who does not want to end the war, because the second he ends the war, that's the end of his political career. And also, he could be subject to, criminal penalties inside of Israel for his corruption cases that were happening when he first came back into office. So this is the real blockade to a deal. But again, PM tells visiting U.S. Secretary Anthony Blinken that potential truce won't forestall Rafa operation. Blinken reiterates U.S. Opposition to the incursion, says Hamas is standing in the way of a ceasefire. So they're saying Hamas is standing in the way of a ceasefire, as Bibi is telling Blinken to his face, even if there was a ceasefire put in place, we're still going to invade Rafa. What kind of a ceasefire is that? That's not a ceasefire. Now, we also have this. So, one of the ex-spokespeople for families of the hostages, right, came out and said, no doubt that Netanyahu is preventing a hostage deal. This is from the ex-spokesperson of the Families Forum, a group that is trying to advocate on behalf of the hostages. There have been protests for months now against Benjamin Netanyahu for not getting a deal to return the hostages. Those protests are being led by family members of the hostages. So save me with any sort of claims that, well, Israel's main priority right now is trying to get their hostages back. No, it's not. On the trajectory that they're currently on, they're much more likely to kill all of their hostages than they are to retrieve their hostages through military means. That is not going to happen. We've already seen them kill their hostages. The white flags. 3 guys who were holding white flags speaking in Hebrew. They killed them in cold blood. We know that hostages who were returned to Israel as a part of the previous temporary truce that was put in place, that many of those hostages come back, and what do they say? They say, one of the main things I was terrified of is that I constantly kept hearing Israeli bombs falling everywhere around me. So, again, save me with this pretend bullshit about how, our goal is just to get the hostages back. No, it's not. You would do a deal if that's what it was actually about. Now, we also have disturbing stories like this ahead of this upcoming Rafah invasion. Israel planning ring of checkpoints to prevent men from fleeing Rafah. Jesus Christ, guys. So they're going to go into Rafah, it looks like. They're going to set up checkpoints, evacuate, I guess, some women and children, and then tell all of the men to hang back. Now, this tracks with every other story that we've talked about in regards to Israel treating any so-called military-aged man as Hamas by default and killing them, rounding them up, mass arresting them, subjecting them to torture. We've seen these stories over and over and over again. And they're, it seems like, openly, doing this again in Rafah ahead of this invasion. Now, a couple other things, and I'll finish off here. Jesus Christ. Israel tells U.S. it will punish Palestinian Authority if the ICC issues these warrants. They will punish the Palestinian Authority for the International Criminal Court trying to hold them accountable for war crimes, for human rights abuses, for violations of international law. They're going to take it out on the Palestinians. They're threatening this to the United States. Which, by the way, just as a reminder, there are many Palestinians who don't like the Palestinian Authority because they are more sympathetic to, trying to work with Israel. Many people view them as complicit with the ongoing ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, etc. But the Palestinian Authority also is they recognize Israel, right? They've attempted to be some sort of a partner in this. And still, the Israeli government talks about them as if they are the same as Hamas. So it's kind of interesting to see that dynamic play out and to see all of the violence that we've seen in the West Bank over the last 6 months and before that, because remember, before October 7th, 2023 was already one of the deadliest years on record for Palestinians in the West Bank. So when you see shit like this, it really kind of exposes the broader project, the broader agenda of what's actually going on here. It's not just about Hamas, guys. I mean, Hamas is, I would argue, not even top 3 of their actual goals in Gaza based on what they've been saying and doing. Now, we finish off with this, just as a reminder. So this is from a couple of days ago, April 25th. Hamas official says group would lay down its arms if an independent Palestinian state is established. So listen, you don't have to trust them at face value. If you don't believe them, call their bluff. Do it. Call their bluff. Establish a state along the 1967 borders, and they're saying they will lay down their arms. If you start this process and they don't lay down their arms, then I guess you can figure it out from there. But call their bluff. You don't believe them? Call their bluff. I wouldn't take them at face value, but this is what they're saying, right? Meanwhile, the United States just vetoed a 2-state solution at the United Nations Security Council. Benjamin Netanyahu has openly said for years that he doesn't agree with having any sort of real Palestinian state in any way, shape, or form. So it's like, who is actually closer to international law here? Who is actually deviating further away from what would actually bring about a long-lasting peace? What Benjamin Netanyahu wants to do right now, okay, and again, I'm not a fan of Hamas. I hate Hamas. But what Benjamin Netanyahu is trying to do right now is to extend this war as long as possible, to thin out the Gaza population as much as possible, to make Gaza uninhabitable, which he's already done that to a very successful degree at this point, but to make life in Gaza impossible, and to continue with the ongoing illegal expansions of settlements in the West Bank. It's an ethnic cleansing. It's a genocide. That's the goal here. They don't want a hostage deal. They don't want a peace deal for the long run to establish a 2-state solution or whatever. They don't want that. They want a continuation of the status quo. They're backed up by the most powerful military government in the world, the United States of America. They get everything they want. Why would they make a deal? The only way that any sort of deal would ever be made is if there is immense international pressure that is brought to bear on not Benjamin Netanyahu, but the Israeli state. That's the only way that this could possibly ever happen, in the same way that it was done to apartheid South Africa. The same thing needs to happen here. So I'll leave you guys off with that. Clearly, Bibi, not too happy, frustrated, panicking right now, and for good reason. Because, contrary to what his claim was there, that this is targeting a democracy and they hate us because they ain't us or whatever the fuck, the reality is that you have committed widespread human rights abuses, widespread war crimes inside of Gaza, and you deserve to be in The Hague, along with your buddies Bezalel Smotrich, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Yoav Gallant, and also, let's add in Joe Biden.
Politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying